Hi, I'm Eric, and I'm back with another video. It is Monday, August 3rd, 2026, and I want to talk about something called the fifth column. And This is the reason I'm doing this is because I've run across a couple of conversations that have gone on in YouTube channels, and I think they bear comment. So I'm going to start off by saying with an introduction, and this is again on my Substack. It's a full article along with quotes and YouTube videos and things, other videos to substantiate the point that I'm trying to make here. So I start off by saying introduction. Margaret Mead said, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, is the only thing that ever has." So here's what a web search has to say about Margaret Mead. She was a renowned cultural anthropologist known for her insights on culture, education, and social change. Her most cited work emphasizes the power of individual agency and critical thinking, both of which are favorite topics of mine, as you probably have noticed. This quote is from a website called quotationsbywomen.com. Now, there are various examples of this, such as the American Revolution itself, the abolitionist movement, the women's suffrage movement, and even the U.S. anti-war and anti-nuclear movements were all able to make radical changes for the better in U.S. policies. Many revolutions against oppressive dictatorships, monarchies, and so on started with a few people talking with each other. Perhaps the best example is China. In the early 20th century, China was called the sick man of Asia. Its people in poverty, drug addiction due to the British-initiated opium wars were ruining society. However, following the 1919 May 4th movement, communism began to gain traction in China. During 1919 and 1920, small groups of people, reading groups, focused on the study of Marxism and began to develop in China with the participants who had been involved in political movements of the 1910s, such as Chen Duxiu and Li Dajiao, as well as younger activists, including Mao Zedong, whom you may have heard of. So here we are, barely 100 years following the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And China has risen from the catastrophe of the Japanese invasions of the 1930s, that was when it hit really rock bottom, to China being the undisputed economy, as well as its huge impact on international relations. From sick men of Asia to world superpower, and it all started with reading groups. Here's an example of the American abolitionist movement. The anti-slavery movement originated during the Age of Enlightenment, that took place in Europe, and focused on ending the transatlantic slave trade. In colonial America, a few German Quakers issued the 1688 Germantown Quaker Petition against slavery, which marked the beginning of the American abolitionist movement. Before the Revolutionary War, evangelical colonists were the primary advocates for the opposition to slavery and the slave trade, doing so on the basis of humanitarian ethics. This comes from a Wikipedia entry. Now, here's the crux of the matter on this topic. I have a copy of the People's History of the United States, however, and to save time, I asked the AI engine DeepSeek to get to the core of the matter. Let me get that actually. Hold on just a second. So this is the Bible of the American left-wing activism, you might say, the People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn. I highly recommend that you get it and read it and just use it as a reference, because it's got all kinds of really amazing information. This book, let's see, Howard Zinn was a professor who opposed the Vietnam War. And there's a story where he was out giving an anti-war speech while his tenure, which is that's when you get a permanent position at a university, was being discussed. And fortunately, they did not overhear his speech, because if they had, they probably would have denied him tenure. But in any case, so this the previous edition of this was published in hardcover in 1999, but it was first published in 1980. So, and finally, I think this is from 2003, 2000. Let's see, this is 2000. This is an edition from 2010. But Howard Zinn, is a great historian, a very important person in our history. In any case, let me continue here. So, I asked DeepSeek to get to the core of the matter. Why did the abolitionist movement fail despite widespread sentiment to end slavery? By fail, I mean that the U.S. Constitution implicitly allowed for slavery. George Washington was a slave owner. Thomas Jefferson was a slave owner. A number of the people who wrote the Constitution were slave owners. And yet, the majority of people didn't want slaves. But we ended up having slavery. So based on Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States, his perspective is that the contradiction between the Declaration's ideals and the reality of slavery was not a failure of principle, but a calculated decision by a powerful elite to protect their own economic and political interests. In Zinn's view, the wealthy founders did not believe the principle of equality applied to everyone, and actively shaped the nation's founding documents to serve their own class interests. So, we thought all men were created equal. We'll get into that a little bit later. So Zinn's core argument is that is a people's history from the bottom up. In other words, it's not written by the. They say history is written by the victors, and Zinn's approach is it should be written by the people. So Zinn's approach is to tell American history from the perspective of the oppressed, the enslaved Native Americans, and the working poor. He argues that the nation's history is a story of class conflict, where a powerful elite consistently used rhetoric about liberty and equality as a tool to maintain control over the lower classes. From this viewpoint, the founding of the United States was not a noble pursuit of universal freedom, but a project by wealthy men to secure their own power and wealth. Zinn explains the contradiction between ideals and reality. Zinn addresses the question about the dictum, all men are created equal, by arguing that it was never meant to be universal. All men is not universal. Interesting. Some men are not really men or women or whatever. For the founders, according to Zinn, this phrase was a tool, the cynicism of these people, to unify the colonists against Britain, not a promise to Black people, women, or the poor. He argued that colonial society was dominated by wealthy white men who had enough money to make others work for them, and that the nation's core principles were designed to benefit this specific group. In his view, the government's support of slavery was a matter of practicality and profit for the elite, not a philosophical contradiction they struggled with. Flashing forward, Hillary Clinton once said that there's two policies, a public policy and a private policy. The public policy is the lies that they tell you, the promises that they make, and the private policy is what they actually decide to do. The institution was a deeply entrenched system of capitalist enrichment, and the ruling class was unwilling to sacrifice their immense wealth, described as 1,000 millions of dollars in the value of their slaves and 1,000 millions of dollars more in the depreciation of their lands. Now, the role of wealthy interests in opposition. Zinn did not ignore opposition to slavery. He documented slave rebellions such as those by Prosser, Vesey, and Turner, and the actions of white abolitionists like John Brown. However, he argued that the government's response was always calculated, like Hillary Clinton talks about. The state was passive in the face of moral opposition and only acted when it became profitable or politically safe to do so. For example, he suggests that Abraham Lincoln's emancipation was a strategic decision orchestrated by the government to limit the scope of freedom and ensure a reconstruction that was safe and profitable rather than truly radical. Bingo. Ultimately, Zinn's analysis frames the persistence of slavery as a direct result of the nation founders prioritizing their own economic and political dominance over the nation's stated ideals. And I put this in bold. The desire to maintain wealth and control, in his view, was the true core principle that guided the country's early leaders. Never question what a small group of committed people can do. And they may be good people and they may be very selfish people. Now let's talk about Roosevelt, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He got elected in the middle of a depression. 25% of the people are out of work. The situation is horrific. And Roosevelt's efforts to correct mass poverty and inequality were nearly sabotaged. There was something called the business plot. The business plot, again, this is from Wikipedia, also called the Wall Street Putsch, was a political conspiracy. Oh, you mean there was a conspiracy? What do you know? There are actually people who get together and can make a conspiracy. Was a political conspiracy in 1933 in the United States to overthrow the government of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and install Smedley Butler as dictator. Butler, a retired Marine Corps Major General, testified under oath that wealthy businessmen were plotting to create a fascist veterans organization with him as its leader and use it in a coup d'etat to overthrow Roosevelt. In 1934, Butler testified under oath before the United States House of Representatives Special Committee on Un-American Activities. Well, that's where it actually did something useful, sort of, on these revelations. Although no one was prosecuted, for treason. What a country. The Congressional Committee final report said there is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. And I might add, if Smedley Butler had not been a man of principle, actually did believe in democratic process. He was a Republican, but he supported democratic process, and he wouldn't go along with these people. In fact, he reported them, which is, he's one of the great heroes of American history, if you ask me. So there are two takeaways from this case study. Just like Orwell said in Animal Farm, all men are created equal, but some are more equal than others. And secondly, a small group of determined, and I would say unscrupulous people wrote the Constitution for their benefit, not ours. One could argue that they're succeeding. The last two presidents were Joe Biden, the senator from MasterCard. He's the senator from Delaware, which is one of the biggest. The corporate law in Delaware protects corporations against the public. And of course, Donald Trump. Both are eager supporters of genocide in Palestine and war on Russia. And, a lot of people don't like that, but who cares about what we think? Now, flash forward to today, and this is one of the inspirations for this discussion. This is the case of Dimitri Lascaris and his former law partners. So Dimitri Lascaris he has a YouTube channel called Reason to Resist, and he travels around the world and he's resisting imperialism and oppression and things like that, and he has been for a long time. So he's talking about the fact that he used to work for a public interest law firm, and but strangely enough, he actually believed in the public interest, but the partners in the law firm didn't. They were just in there for the money. In any case, he talks about his not he personally knows people who were in high positions of the government in Canada. So I'm quoting here from what he had to say. He said, "We were sitting down having dinner, and right across from me was McKinnon and his Isizinga, who were two politicians of the Liberal Party, the one that promises and always breaks them and always breaks the promises. And one of them looked over at me as we were having dinner, and he said to me, 'Hey, Dimitri, I can't understand why you're involved with the Green Party.' And I found this question to be quite curious because I expected that it would be obvious why I was involved with the Green Party. But I immediately responded, and honestly, as follows. As I said, the reason I'm with the Green Party is because of all the parties that are in Canada's Parliament. It is the one whose core values most closely align with my own. I may not agree with everything the Green Party says, but it is the one that I feel most comfortable with from the perspective of principle." And at that point, they kind of looked at each other, looked at me, thought my answer was kind of bizarre, that judging from their expression. And then I had decided to ask them. I said, "Why are you so active and committed in the Liberal Party?" And without, blinking an eye, they both gave the same answer. And the answer was, "Because we win." That was their answer. Had nothing to do with values, had nothing to do with principles. It was all about power. And they made absolutely no bones about the fact that it was all about power. They didn't feel even remotely ashamed, as far as I could tell, to answer my question in that way. And that pretty much defines who liberals are, especially the power brokers in the Liberal Party. These people don't give a rat's ass about human rights, about genocide, about racism, about conquests, about violations of the United States Charter, about equality, about compassion, about human decency. All they care about is power. And frankly, they're pretty damn good at acquiring it in our compromised political and economic system. That's Dmitry Lascaris. Now let's turn to Project Ukraine. For those of you who don't know, the CIA empowered for many years Ukrainian nationalist collaborators of Germany after they lost World War II. Many escaped into the United States and Canada. These were the people, a minority, by the way, who committed serious atrocities against Poles, Jews, Russians, and other Ukrainians before being driven underground or escaped or gone to prison. After years, their descendants resurfaced in 2014, and with U.S. backing, overthrew the democratically elected government of President Yanukovych. What ensued was an 8-year smoldering civil war, eventually having increased shelling of breakaway areas in eastern Ukraine from 40 shells a day. Can you imagine your neighborhood being shelled every day for 8 years? To 1,000 or more a day. Russia preempted what was sure to be a mass murder and ethnic cleansing of Donetsk and Lugansk. This has been thoroughly documented. Germany and France and Poroshenko of Ukraine conspired to approve the Minsk agreements, which would have given autonomy to the eastern areas of Ukraine, and they knowingly violated that, and they planned an attack to destroy the people who opposed a U.S.-sponsored coup. So this is another example of a small minority of extremists having a big and highly negative effect on a whole country. And I have a link to a video by Texas Russell Bentley, who in 2015 was patrolling a village that had basically been bombed out by these people. So anytime they tell you that Russia invaded in 2022 unprovoked, just watch that video. He tells you exactly what's going on. Your tax dollars at work bombing innocent people who opposed a U.S.-sponsored coup. Now the question arises, why is it taking so long? Why has this war in Ukraine dragged on for now 4.5 years? Many of us had thought that the war would be over in a few weeks. It's now 4.5 years, and it's still going on. So what happened? A couple of years ago, I asked a Russian friend of mine in Moscow why the war didn't end soon. His opinion is that wealthy interests, both Russian and Ukrainian, don't want the war to end because they profit from it. As Lindsey Graham said, killing Russians and fighting to the last Ukrainian made him very happy. Now, there's I post another video. This is on YouTube of a Russian military expert, and this is what he has to say about this issue of private interests in their role, small group of private interests in their role, and how that affects a society. So I'm going to quote here. These are, this is a quote from the transcript of this discussion that he had. He says, in general, it should be noted that capitalism as a social system generally generates a genetically fifth column in any country. And in Russia, and in particular, given the special size, given the population, mentality, and everything else. Therefore, one of the reasons why capitalism has always led to a national catastrophe in Russia, but the February Revolution of the 17th year, that is 1917, was a national catastrophe. And it was the October Revolution that was the national salvation. So this transcript is a little difficult. I hope that I can make it clear to you. It says, this was well raised by thinking officers of the Imperial Army who came to serve in the Red Army. Today we see this with our own eyes. So what happened in Russia in February 1991, the first year that Russia received, and what remains of it, and what we now are trying to restore, in what ways we are restoring, and we restore again through mobilization, through government agencies. This is a fundamental question. Now, what he's talking about here is that in 1917, the Tsarist government was losing the war, and there were terrible casualties, and as a result, a group of liberal interests got rid of the Tsar, but they wanted to keep fighting the war. And of course, Russia was losing that war, and lots of people were dying, and it was being invaded. But in the October Revolution was the Bolshevik Revolution, and they took over the government, and against all odds, including being invaded by Western powers, including the United States and England, and the holdovers from the Tsarist regime, they defeated all of them. So flashing forward to 1991, Russia was again, it was compromised, and the system that they had in place, for whatever faults it had, was they basically surrendered to capitalism, and the country was nearly dismembered, very, very close to getting dismembered. So the question, so he says, therefore, the answer is unambiguous, which you ask, of course, without switching the rails of socialism. Well, someone doesn't like the pure word socialism. I'll change this matter to the rails of military socialism. So what he's talking about here is the fact that the reason why Russia has been successful in its war of the United States and NATO. So you have, the United States has a population of what, 330 million. NATO European countries have a population of another at least 400 million, and yet Russia is able to outproduce them militarily. Likewise, he pointed out that this fellow Sivkov said that during World War II, Russia was attacked by the Germans, and yet because Stalin took on the task as a government project to arm the country, they were able to defeat it. His point being that when private interests get involved in fighting wars, they're doing it for their own profit, not necessarily for the benefit of winning for the country. So the question is, how's it going in the USA? And I raise this because he's raising two issues. One is the issue of militarism, and the other issue is privatization. What happens when military interests and private interests are mixed up or are operating in any economy? I'd submit to you that the twin killers of the US economy are privatization and militarization. These Russians argue that state coordination is necessary to fight a war. So how does the US stack up on winning wars with a privatized military? In short, from the stalemate of Korea to Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, the US has lost most of its wars, even against third world countries or countries with far smaller militaries. It has been able to capture Venezuela, and it won its wars against Yugoslavia, Libya, and Grenada. These are not exactly superpowers. So we're looking at the budget here. I've got another link here to the defense budget, and it says that the bottom line is that Congress has not enacted the fiscal year 2027 National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA, as one of the report's publications on July 24th, 2026. But the trajectory is clear. Defense authorization levels will exceed $1.14 trillion, with the administration pushing for an additional $350 billion in mandatory spending. The House and Senate have largely aligned on the top line figure, while disagreeing on specific allocations, most notably on military construction. But we're talking about 1.14 trillion plus 350 billion. That works out to be, if I can add in my head, $1.49 trillion, almost $1.5 trillion in military spending by the United States government. This is from tax money, and it's also from borrowing. So I've got here. This is a screenshot from showing the top 10 countries. It shows the top 10 countries. I just chose United States is number one. This was the 2025 budget. United States $954 billion, China $336 billion, and Russia with $190 billion. So the United States exceeds the combined Chinese and Russian military budgets by $400 billion, and it's going up by another $500 billion, and yet we don't seem to be able to bring these countries to heel. But it's even worse than that, because in Iran, the Iranian military spending in 2026, it says Iran's officially reported 2025 defense spending was $7.4 billion per the Stockholm Independent Peace Research Institute. It says a 5.6% real terms decline. It says the actual military expenditure is expected to be 2 to 3 times larger once the IRGC nuclear program and proxy support are included, even though the nuclear program is not even it's not a military program. So this is not exactly a model of free market efficiency. We're talking about The U.S. military budget is 43 times the size of Iran, and yet we have not been able to take Iran out the way Donald Trump thought we were going to do in a week. Now, what about so let's talk about the real costs of war. This comes from the Cost of War project from Brown University. So it says that in the 2 years since the October 7th, 2023 Hamas attack on Israel, the U.S. government has spent $21.7 billion on military aid to Israel. The U.S. has spent an additional $9.65 to $12 billion on military operations in Yemen and the wider region since October 7th, 2023, for a total of, let's call it $33 billion. And this House resolution calls for the Pentagon and military-related programs in fiscals 25 to 2029. In fiscal year 2026, it increases Pentagon and military-related spending by over 13% from fiscal year 2025, going well beyond the $1 trillion mark. This is corroborating what I was talking about earlier. It says, what is the real cost of war? U.S. military spending produces an average of 5 jobs per 1 million in spending. That means get a job with a military-industrial complex, and 5 jobs, 1 million. You get $200,000 a year working for the military-industrial complex, including both direct jobs and jobs in the private industry supply chain. In contrast, 13 jobs are created for every 1 million in education spending, nearly 3 times as much employment. And you wonder why people are working at Starbucks. Between 2020 and 2024, $771 billion in Pentagon contracts went to just 5 firms. These are not U.S. government-owned firms, I assure you. Lockheed Martin, $313 billion. RTX, formerly Raytheon, $145 billion. Boeing, $115 billion. General Dynamics, $116 billion. And Northrop Grumman, $81 billion. In comparison, the total diplomacy, development, and humanitarian aid budget, excluding military aid, was $356 billion. So we're spending twice as much. And this money is going to private interests. This is what I'm talking about here. So the U.S. spends over twice as much as China in military spending, even after accounting for differences in labor cost and purchasing power. While the Russian military maintains the world's largest stockpile of nuclear weaponry, the Russian defense budget amounts to less than 1/10 of the U.S. defense budget. Western strategists have a long tradition of overinflating Russia as a military threat. This is the Cost of War project from Brown University. Let me repeat that. Let me repeat that to those of you who say that I'm engaging in agitprop. Western strategists have a long tradition of overinflating Russia as a military threat. Spending on post-9/11 wars from 2001 through 2022, the United States appropriated and is obligated to spend an estimated $8 trillion for the post-9/11 wars, an estimated $5.8 trillion in appropriations, plus another $2.2 trillion for obligations to care for the veterans of these wars through the next several decades. I'll skip the next section, but you get the point here. I'll leave this. You can read the rest of it, but you get the idea here that we're spending huge amounts of money on the military, and it's basically money down a rat hole. So now let's talk about privatization, because on the one hand you have the military privatization, Russia is saying the reason why they're able to outproduce the West is because they have socialized their military-industrial complex to a large extent, not completely, but to a large extent. But in the United States case and in Europe's case, it's all going, the profits are going towards military contractors, private interests. So this is an article from In These Times, and it says, handing public assets and services over to the free market has been a boon for corporate America and a disaster for the working class. And when it comes to saving money, the evidence is mixed at best. I'm quoting here from their article. In many cases, privatization turns out to be far more costly, as we've seen. A 2007 survey found that over half of the local governments that placed services back under public control did so because privatization didn't cut costs. After Iowa hired insurance corporations to manage its Medicaid program in 2017, the average cost of insurance people climbed nearly 3 times as fast as when it was under public control. So when Obama talks about Obamacare, but we can't have a public option. No. We have to enrich those insurance companies. Yes. So it increased 3 times as fast as when it was under public control. In Indiana, a toll road built using private financing, known as a public-private partnership, launched in 2014 by then Governor Mike Pence, turned out to be $137.3 million more expensive than if the state had used traditional public financing. Charter schools, which are publicly funded but privately operated, are costing San Diego's school district $65.9 million a year. And then there's healthcare, an area where the United States spends twice as much as other countries, thanks to the free market of private doctors, nurses, hospitals, and drugs. So, the conclusion. While it is certainly true that small groups of people committed to helping their people, countries, and the planet can do a lot of good, the reality is that a small group of people who in most cases control or at least influence public policy grossly distort a society, resulting in long-term failure. Class war is a real thing. And in the case of the US and Europe, which has had its heyday mainly by theft of other societies' wealth through conquest, slavery, and colonialism, in the long run, wealthy elites' greed and selfishness end up weakening their society. The parasites weaken their unwilling or unaware hosts, resulting in their own demise unless they can find new victims, which is exactly what Europe's problem with Russia is. They lost their colonies, and now they're going after Russia because they hope to break up Russia to regain cheap assets. That's what the war in Ukraine is all about from a European standpoint. So times have changed, and they probably won't get away with it, which is why they're so desperate. So that's what I have to say here. We have an issue of small groups of people who can do the right thing and help people a lot, but we have in many more cases, small groups of people who can really wreck their societies, cause wars, and cause massive amounts of suffering. And so I just wanted to bring this issue to your attention because it's not just a question of militarism, it's a question of privatization of a society, privatization of the wealth, and using war to enrich small groups of people. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you will, I hope this has enlightened you a little bit. And, please like and share this video. And also, please support my channel if you would be so kind, making a donation or buying a t-shirt or something from my Peace and Enlightenment shop. So thank you again for listening, and I will talk with you again soon.